Good evening, and welcome to Georgia Southwestern State University. I'm Professor Bonnie Levine Berggren, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Global South Seminar. This lecture series is named after and endowed by the late Professor Emeritus Harold Isaacs, who served as a history professor at Georgia Southwestern for 49 years. During his tenure at GSW, Professor Isaacs taught courses in Latin American history, African American history, and established minors in Black Studies and Third World Studies. In 1981, he launched the Third World in Perspective seminar series, and 2 years later, he established the Association of Third World Studies. In 1984, the Journal of Third World Studies followed. This journal addressed the problems and issues facing less developed countries all over the world. Following Professor Isaacs' death in 2015, the name of the journal was changed to the Journal of Global South Studies and is published by the University of Florida on behalf of the now named Association of Global South Studies. As part of his bequest to GSW, Professor Isaacs requested that part of the monies be used each semester to bring a guest speaker to campus to talk to the campus community about issues and opportunities facing the Global South. Tonight, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Martin Nekola. Dr. Nekola comes to us from the Czech Republic, where he is a researcher, historian, political scientist, security analyst, and lecturer. Dr. Nekola earned his doctorate in political science from Charles University in Prague. He is fluent in multiple languages, including German and English, as well as has working knowledge of several other European languages. He has extensive research experience, including a postdoctorate research fellowship at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., and was a Fulbright postdoctorate research fellow at Columbia University. Dr. Nekola has also been the recipient of many other research grants, both in the United States and abroad. He has been an election observer in multiple European elections, including the Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Dr. Nekola is a member of several professional organizations and has presented his research at numerous international conferences, as well as many universities in the United States. He's well published in both book and journal format and has 2 additional books forthcoming. Tonight, he will be speaking to us on the current state of democracy in the Ukraine, particularly since the Russian invasion of the country in early 2022. After he concludes his presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask him questions. Welcome, Dr. Nekola.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bonnie, for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm from the Czech Republic. I was born and I'm living in Prague, in the capital. I'm both historian and political scientist. I focus on non-democratic regimes, on the era of communism, and also on the Czech communities in the United States. So from time to time, usually twice a year or even 3 times a year, I come to the States to do research, to give lectures, to meet the local Czech communities. And now I'm back. I'm on another tour. I've been here for 2 weeks already, and 10 more days are ahead of me. So I'm just in the middle of my mission. So thank you again for having me. Today I'm going to talk about the current war in Ukraine and how it affects other European countries, including the Czech Republic. Nevertheless, let me begin with a very brief characteristics of Ukraine and its historical overview, because I believe that this is crucial for understanding what is happening there right now. As you probably know, Ukraine is a country in Eastern Europe with beautiful nature, mountains, Black Sea, fertile land, brave, proud, and friendly people. The land has a total area of 233 square miles and a total coastline of 1,700 miles. This land area is approximately 87% of the area of Texas. So for European standards, it's it's pretty big country. Actually, it's the 45th largest country in the world. The population before the war was about 44 million, and 70% of them lived in the cities. The highest mountain peak, Hoverla, is 2,000 meters high, but Ukraine is comparatively low at an average elevation of some 170 meters. There are direct national borders with 7 neighboring countries, meaning Belarus, Hungary, Moldova, Poland, Romania, Russia, and Slovakia. The history of Ukrainian territory has always been very dramatic. Over the past 10 centuries, Ukraine has repeatedly been carved up by competing powers. Mongol warriors from the east conquered Kiev and Rus in the 13th century. In the 16th century, the Polish and Lithuanian armies invaded from the west. In the 17th century, the war between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Tsardom of Russia brought lands to the east of the Dnieper River under Russian imperial control. The east became known as left bank Ukraine, and lands to the west of Dnieper, the right bank, were ruled by Poland. Southern regions, including Crimea or Crimean Peninsula, were part of Ottoman Empire. More than a century later, in 1793, Western Ukraine was annexed by the Russian Empire. And over the years that followed, a policy known as Russification banned the use and study of Ukrainian language, and people were also pressured to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. Nevertheless, Ukraine suffered some of its greatest traumas during the 20th century. After the Communist Revolution in 1917, Ukraine was one of the many countries to fight a brutal civil war before being fully absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1922. In the early 1930s, to force peasants to join collective farms, Soviet leader Stalin orchestrated a famine that resulted in the starvation and death of millions of people. And afterwards, Stalin also imported large numbers of Russians and other Soviet citizens to Ukraine, and they had no ability to speak Ukrainian, and they had no real ties with the region. So that was his intention to repopulate Ukraine. The westernmost part of the country was the so-called Zakarpattia region, was even a part of Czechoslovakia in the interwar period. But the majority of its population was Hungarian, Jewish, and Rusin. Rusin, it's a specific Slavic nation, a small community with their own language, religion, and traditions. After the Nazis invaded or attacked Soviet Union in June 1944, Ukraine witnessed probably the most brutal atrocities, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes of all occupied territories. And after World War II ended, the re-established Soviet power continued with further terror and forced population movements. So you can see that historically there was not a single Ukrainian state. Because Eastern Ukraine came under Russian control much earlier than the West, people in the East also have and always had stronger ties to Russia, and have been more likely to support Russian-leaning leaders. Western Ukraine, by contrast, spent centuries under the shifting control of European powers. Poland, the Austrian-Hungary Empire, even Czechoslovakia, Hungary. So this is one of the reasons why in the West the people have recently tended to support more Western-leaning politicians. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country, independent nation. But uniting the country proved a very difficult task. The sense of Ukrainian patriotism and awareness of unique national history was much deeper in the West. Also, the transition to democracy and capitalism was painful and very chaotic, and many Ukrainians, especially the ones in the East, longed for relative stability, social benefits, and assured employment of the earlier periods under the Soviet Union. As you can see here, even Even the results of presidential and parliamentary elections in past 2 decades show obvious differences in voters' preferences and support to political parties and candidates on both banks of Dnieper River. So a kind of dangerous nostalgia of this Soviet nostalgia, corruption reaching from the lowest local municipal administrations up to the central government in Kiev, unfulfilled populist promises, ineffective reforms, and power struggles between unscrupulous oligarchs led to further dissatisfaction and unrest in the society. And then November 2013 came, and the beginning of the so-called Euromaidan revolution, caused by the decision of a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, to reject the association agreement with the European Union. This led to huge manifestations in Kiev, lasting for several months, and these events eventually led to the overthrow of Yanukovych. The Russian-speaking population of the country in the east saw this, thanks to the intensive media massage by Kremlin propaganda channels, as an unlawful coup d'etat orchestrated by the United States and by Western powers. And thus the, I would say, abyss of misunderstanding between the people in the west and the east of the country even deepened. And right after that, the uprisings in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, backed by Moscow, began, and the Russian military intervention and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in late February 2014. And now, some 8 years later, we continue to see the consequences, and even worse. The ongoing war, called a special military operation by the Kremlin, brought an entirely new geopolitical situation that affected many countries, changed the entire European continent, and also gave to Ukraine, despite all its tragedies, victims, and destruction of the infrastructure, a great and unrepeatable chance to start over. Now let me make a short break and share my personal experience from Ukraine. As mentioned, from time to time I participate in the election observation missions organized by the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Even before that, I had a chance to visit the Zakarpattia region several times as a tourist, and had a great time when hiking and riding a bike, exploring the beautiful mountains. In addition, my own grandfather was born there in 1934 when it was part of Czechoslovakia. And then in 2014, I had a chance to observe the election in the country, even twice, for both the parliamentary and the presidential election. So it was very shortly after Maidan. So the situation in the country was still kind of sensitive. I was in the capital, in Kiev. I was observing the election in Kharkiv, the second largest Ukrainian city, only a few miles from Russian border. I was also in Ivano-Frankivsk, which is in the western part of the country. And I also visited numerous small towns and villages and rural areas where we also observed the election process. A few pictures. Here you can see one of the rural polling stations. Then you can see on the top there is this large statue and monument, actually the largest monument of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the largest monument in Eastern Europe, made of granite and bronze, placed in the middle of the so-called Freedom Square in Kharkiv. But only a few weeks later it was toppled and demolished. The other two pictures on the top come from Kiev, actually from Maidan, from the square, and you can still see the charred buildings and tents and barricades, basically remains of the revolution and of the unrest. And below, that's me at 6 a.m. at the beginning of a very long shift, usually lasting for 22 or even 24 hours. At the beginning of the E-Day. Here I'm still full of energy and expectations, but not for long. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not biased. I have deep sympathies for Ukrainians. I have friends among them. I have even studied Ukrainian language for 2 years at the university. However, when I was there in 2014, I came to understand that the country was in a very deep troubles, even without any Russian interference. I mentioned that before, the level of corruption, Soviet mindset, backwardness, 10 miles from Kiev, you saw a completely different world. Underdeveloped 19th century-like villages without proper infrastructure, poverty, and no light at the end of the tunnel for most of the people who simply don't have the right connections and enough money to bribe the authorities. And the elections were a great example. On paper, everything looked perfect. A new election law based on EU recommendations was adopted. All procedures were followed. Members of the election committees seemed to be very well prepared and competent. The voters were excited and the turnout was very high. But during the E-Day, we realized that there was something fishy. We saw obvious intimidation of voters. The secrecy of voting wasn't ensured. We saw some unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles, campaigning in front of the polling stations, very strange role of police officers who shouldn't have been there at the polling stations, and above all, these men in black leather jackets with 3 cell phones, who looked like the ones in charge, the real bosses on site, who were receiving orders by phone from someone else, from some bigger bosses. And these guys were present at the polling stations and during the E-Day, and later they were also present at the district election committee where the counting and tabulation, meaning the most important part of the E-Day, took place. To be fair, I met the very same times also in Belarus, in Armenia, in Georgia. You can always recognize them, as I said, black leather jackets, too many rings, and usually white socks in the half shoes. Let me emphasize, this wasn't the fault of ordinary Ukrainians. It was the fault of the system they were living in. A system that looked nice, democratic, transparent, meeting Western standards at first sight. However, in reality, it was rotten inside, fake in many news, developed and deformed by the oligarchs and by crooked politicians whose only concern was to keep power and to embezzle as much money as possible, not to help the people, not to contribute to a healthy progress of the country as a whole. So I felt very sorry about that, and my Ukrainian friends actually shared the very same frustration. So that was the situation in 2014, 8 years ago. Since then, the country undoubtedly made an incredible jump towards becoming a modern country with a strong civil society, with democratic institutions and control mechanisms. But I guess that many issues still remained unresolved. There were still too many, elephants in the room, right? Above all, the Soviet legacy and the strong ties with Russia. And Ukraine was only on halfway to being considered a real candidate for European Union membership and becoming equal partner and member of the Western structures. Therefore, I believe that the ongoing war, although it's an unspeakable tragedy and catastrophe, might also become a unique opportunity for Ukraine to start over, to break free of the shackles of the past, to gain new confidence. For example, in my country, in the Czech Republic, for the past 30 years, the Ukrainians were mostly seen as a cheap labor force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were coming to Czechia every year as seasonal workers in agriculture, as workers in factories, construction workers. Thanks to Ukrainian men, we have our highways, we have our subway in Prague, houses, shopping centers. Thanks to Ukrainian women, our corridors and offices are clean, our shirts are ironed, our gardens are well maintained, our packages are delivered. But it is my sincere hope that after this terrible war, hopefully it will be soon over, we will acknowledge and admire the Ukrainians as heroes, as fighters, as defenders of freedom and democratic values. As we all know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in the morning of February 24th, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The unprovoked and unjustified aggression that brought military conflict into the heart of Europe after many decades caused many unexpected consequences. I won't talk about the developments on the fronts because I'm far from being an expert on military issues. But you know that the defense and combat skills of the Ukrainian army was a great surprise for everyone, especially for Putin and his generals, who kind of expected that the country would surrender and would fall apart within a few days after the invasion. I would instead like to mention the impact on Europe, meaning the European Union. You know that the EU has 27 members now, after Great Britain left, following the Brexit and the referendum in June 2016. In the past few years, coexistence under one flag, under one umbrella of the European Union and the cooperation wasn't always easy because of the individual specific political and economic interests of the countries, of the member states. And there were many issues that even deepened misunderstandings between the Eastern and Western members, meaning the old members of the EU and the new members that joined the Union in 2004, like the Czech Republic, and then later in 2007 and 2013. These were formerly communist countries or belonging to the Soviet sphere of influence during the Cold War. It was the bankruptcy of Greece, Brexit, the migration crisis, and also attitudes towards Russia that were reasons for serious discords, and reaching a common European solution became almost impossible. For example, the crucial German economy depended 65% on Russian gas. Hungary and Cyprus, another two member states, were always considered Trojan horses of the Kremlin in the European Union. The same with many Italian politicians, even the candidate for the presidency of France, Marine Le Pen, was also expressing vocal sympathies towards Putin and his regime. And after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the European Union only raised a warning finger and introduced limited sanctions with no real harm for Russia. So after February 24th of this year, everyone was tensely awaiting what the response of the European Union to Russia's war adventure would be. This time, fortunately, the European Union has shown incredible unity and strength and has provided Ukraine with significant political, financial, military support and also humanitarian aid to Ukrainian refugees. The Czech Republic, for example, accepted more than 350,000 people. 85% of them were women and children, and many more were even settled in neighboring countries, Poland, Hungary, Moldova. The total number of Ukrainian refugees recently reached 7 million, I guess, or 6.5. In addition, the European Union adopted a whole scale of sanctions against Russia and Belarus. The European Union agreed on altogether 8 sanction packages in the past 7 months. That included a closure of EU airspace to all Russian aircrafts, suspension of Russian broadcasting and propaganda channels in the European Union, prohibition of new investments into the Russian energy sector, prohibition on most of the imports from Russia, closure of EU ports to all Russian vessels, sanctions against individuals and companies linked with Kremlin, and freezing or confiscation of their property, meaning bank accounts, villas, yachts of the oligarchs, etc. And even more restrictive rules for Russian citizens when applying for visas. Now it's more expensive, it lasts a longer time, etc. Above all, the drastic reduction of Russian banking and finance sector is very painful to Moscow. Let me remind you that also approximately 50% of the financial reserves of the Russian Central Bank were frozen. The same with energy, transportation, technologies, and experts say that the Russian economy would need at least 20 years to recover, if the war ended today. But with further escalation of the conflict, the consequences can be predicted. On the other hand, the war is also having a disruptive effect on global markets. Since the conflict began in February, there has been a sharp increase in world prices of key commodities, in particular fuel and crops, because Ukraine was the world's largest producer, exporting even to Africa, China, Australia. And due to the blockade of Ukrainian ports in Black Sea by Russian vessels, the products simply could not reach the customers, or they were simply stolen and sold by the Russians to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, one of a few of Putin's remaining allies. In the case of the countries in African Horn, for example, suffering from a disastrous drought, the stoppage of Ukrainian grain aggravated famine and created another humanitarian catastrophe. And it may also lead to a global food crisis. Speaking about the European Union only, the war has also caused uncertainty about the security of the energy supply. Russia, which is the EU's main supplier on fossil fuels, has suspended gas delivery to a number of European countries, prompting the EU to quickly respond to secure supply in all member states. In May of this year, the European Council, meaning European government, agreed on a ban on almost 90% of all Russian oil imports by the end of this year. Also, Russia cut the flow of its gas via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Fortunately, the European countries managed to replace most of it with liquefied natural gas from Norway, Qatar, Nigeria, even from the United States. Speaking specifically about the Czech Republic, we had a warm summer and stable weather, so the consumption of gas by households wasn't so big. But now the winter season is coming, and even our government doesn't know for sure how the situation will develop in upcoming few weeks. At each case, the price of gas and electricity has already doubled or even tripled, and the state has had to launch new programs or of financial assistance for low-income groups who simply couldn't afford to pay such price increases. So we are currently experiencing a series of bankruptcies and factory closures because the cost of operation simply became too high. And for the managements, it's unprofitable to keep the factories running, at least for now. So there is another side effect. The unemployment rate is rising dramatically, and our inflation rate currently is about 15%, and everyone expects that it would reach 20% at the end of this year. So it's really very dramatic. To secure the energy supply at affordable prices and to fill gas storage facilities before winter, that's the main goal and challenge for all European governments, as well as for the European leadership in Brussels. Energy dependence on Russia is especially true in Germany. We are talking about 60–65%. And the government of previous German Chancellor Angela Merkel decided to close all nuclear plants. And there was another problem. There was no strong wind over the Baltic Sea this year, meaning no power from wind power plants. So now the Germans have to reconsider their energy policy within a few weeks and basically delay the strategies or replace and change the strategies planned and implemented for many years. And the Czech Republic, as a small neighboring country, always heavily responded to what was happening in Germany and on the German energy market. So these days it has been confirmed that we don't have the situation in our hands, and we have to get ready for more price shocks on crucial commodities, above all the fossil fuels, Just for your information, a liter of regular gas in the summer in the Czech Republic costs some 50 Czech koruna, which means $9 per gallon. So this is really much more expensive than in here. So whatever the outcome of the war in Ukraine will be, a return to normal trade and normal relations with Russia, to which we were accustomed for past 30 years, cannot be expected in any of the following 5 possible scenarios of development. So one of the possible scenarios, what might happen in upcoming few months, is the victory of Russia. You know that since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has been advancing from the north, from the east and the south, and in the direction of the main cities of Ukraine. And although the Russian army has not been able to capture any of these, and the speed of the attack has been reduced due to the strong Ukrainian resistance, Russia maintains military superiority over Ukraine in terms of troops and equipment. Ukraine, for its part, has been receiving military aid from the West, which in turn has launched a battery of sanctions against Russia, as I mentioned. This first scenario also refers to the collapse of the Ukrainian resistance and a total military victory for Russia, leading to a change of government in Kiev, and also leading to the partition of Ukraine, meaning that Russia would probably absorb the eastern part of the country with Russian-speaking population. All of Moscow's objectives would thus be fulfilled: consolidation of the annexation of Crimea, recognition of the separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, disarmament of the Ukrainian army, and the end of the initiatives of Ukraine to join the European Union and NATO. So that's possible scenario number 1. Hopefully this one won't happen, right? The second one is the victory of Ukraine. You know that Ukrainians have shown unity and the will to fight, and the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, even refused to leave the capital, despite it being one of the main targets of Russia's offensive. And the Russian troops already were on the outskirts of the capital. The slowing of Russia's advance on all fronts, it might lead to exhaustion of Russian troops, while the arms shipments from the West to support Ukraine would intensify, and the effects of the sanctions against Russia and Belarus would touch more strongly the Russian economy and even the Russian population. So in this scenario, which could also happen, the Russian military effort collapses, Ukraine mounts counterattacks through which it recovers part or all of its lost territories, and the situation leads to the peace agreement whereby Russia, defeated, withdraws its troops and their claims on the country. The consequences of this scenario would be catastrophic for Russia, of course, affecting also Putin's continuity in government, or leading the leader to increase internal repressions and isolation of the country. Another possible scenario is, I called it negotiated exit. A ceasefire and peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine would end the war, but would not necessarily bring a solution to the issue of Crimea or Donbas territories raised in 2014, even if Kiev formally recognizes the situation. But both sides will be able to claim a partial victory, and the international community could then seek to lift sanctions and to restore trade relations, although tensions will continue. It is unclear, however, how long it might take to reach a deal, and if it happens, how long it might survive. Scenario number 4 is uncontrolled climbing or escalation. In this scenario, Russia's military failure in its attempt to take control of the whole Ukrainian territory becomes evident, but Russian president rejects any withdrawal and decides to escalate the conflict, probably by threatening to use Russia's nuclear arsenal. One scale could involve the use of tactical nuclear weapons, lower power warheads designed for use in the context of conventional conflict against Ukrainian targets, but it could also lead to a threat to use strategic nuclear weapons against NATO members, whom Putin already views as enemies for their military aid to Ukraine. So the consequences of the escalation to this level could be unimaginable for the entire world, but it is to be expected that tensions will initially spill over the former Soviet states and now within NATO, and that China will also be forced to take a more active role in the conflict. And scenario number 5 is stagnation. Russia's advance stalls on all fronts, but the invading troops fortify their positions and hold on to the conquered territory. Meanwhile, reinforcements and resources are still sent to the Ukraine. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, have a defense that Russia cannot penetrate, but they have difficulty going on the offensive. Aid from the West is maintained, but NATO reduces its participation to avoid further escalation. So the conflict in this way, and in the face of the failure of the peace talks, decreases in intensity and becomes a war of positions, similar to the one that has confronted the separatists in Donbas region and the Ukrainian government since 2014, which could also last for many years. Meanwhile, living conditions in Russia are collapsing due to the sanctions, and the country begins to look for possible alternatives that could bring it closer to China, India, and other countries. An eternal war in Europe could then generate destabilizing effects throughout the region, similar to the case of the dissolution of Yugoslavia in 1990s, or the frozen conflict in Moldova. That's been also lasting for almost 3 decades. So as we speak, the war is ongoing, and we can't predict right now which one of these outcomes, these scenarios, becomes reality and when. Every other day of the war is undoubtedly a tragedy with humanitarian, political, and economic consequences. Today, as inflation rate in European countries rises, we, as I mentioned, see the jump in energy prices. When oil rose by 63%, electricity by 240%, gas even by 370%. We also face another wave of refugees. So these are simply the costs of war, which may, however, also bring some good and hope for the future. Shift away from Russian gas and oil supplies, and therefore less influence and interference from the Kremlin in European matters, that would be a good thing, a good news for us. Ukraine has already applied for the membership in the European Union. It became a candidate country in an accelerated process, and there is a hope that the country will become an equal member of the European community. But in my opinion, based on my experience from that country, I think it will last at least 10 years, because Ukraine simply had many internal problems, even without the Russian invasion and interference. And the necessary reforms and basically rebirth of the nation will be complicated, painful, with many sacrifices, with no doubts. Nevertheless, as I've had the chance to meet many Ukrainians, to visit various parts of their beautiful country and to learn the details from its history, I'm pretty sure they will succeed. On the other hand, we should not fight and punish ordinary Russians. Václav Havel, the first president of Czechoslovakia after the fall of the Iron Curtain, visited the United States in January 1990, and he gave a speech in the Congress in DC, and he asked your congressmen and senators, please let's help all together the Soviet Union on its complicated way to democracy. So I think that now we are in a similar situation. Although, believe me, I have intensive or extensive experience with Russians, with their selfishness, arrogance, and false idea of and conviction of their own exceptionality. I still believe in their sense of responsibility, in their rationality, in self-preservation instinct, if you wish, and I hope that the the core of the civil society, although it's been persecuted and silenced for many years, simply would not allow the lunatic in the Kremlin to use the nuclear weapons. So let's hope for the best, but expect worst. Thank you very much. Now, if you want to spare my vocal cords and you are too shy to ask the question now, then here's my email, so feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to your questions now. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the corruption within the voting areas to the previous election, but I was wondering, was there any concrete evidence beyond that? I know you were physically there and saw it at those locations, but was there any more evidence to the fact that there was corrupt voting?
Yeah, we as election observers, we need to fill out the forms and make marks on all the happenings and everything we have seen at the polling stations, and there was a clear evidence of carousel voting. We saw buses full of old ladies who had no idea where they were, and these guys in black leather jackets were handing them, the ballot papers. We saw campaigning in front of the polling stations. Even it was forbidden by law during the E-Day to do the campaign, to hand over the leaflets and posters. But still, we were able to see that. Corruption, yeah, that's a great, huge issue in Ukraine. I recently read an analysis by the Transparency International, and they said that before the war, almost 70% of the money for investments was stolen by the oligarchs, by the local criminal circles. So, it's not how the modern Western European country shall work, right? So, as I said, I believe that something needs to be changed from the bottom, that Ukrainians simply have to launch reforms, which will be long and painful for them. Yes, more questions? Yes, sir. Well, first of all, I think that Putin was very surprised. I read 8 of his biographies, and all the authors claim that this guy is living in the 20th century. He isn't using cell phone, he isn't using internet. Basically, all the information from the outside world come from very short reports written by his generals and by his advisors. So he probably miscalculated the whole situation. He thought that when the Russian army comes to Ukraine, they will be, will come as liberators, and that the Russian-speaking population would right away say, we want to join Russia. But it didn't happen. Even in Kharkiv, which is the second largest Ukrainian city, with 100% or 80, 90% of Russian-speaking population, they didn't want to join Russia. They wanted to stay in Ukraine. So I think that was a big miscalculation. And also now Ukraine is the second largest and strongest and most powerful armies on the European continent, thanks to all Western weapons and American weapons that were delivered in past few months. So that makes the situation even more complicated, that simply Russians are out of guns, of bullets, of tanks, of aircrafts. So yeah. But I'm not military strategist, so I don't know the exact situation on the fronts. You know that Ukrainian cities have been bombed in past few days, heavily bombed. On the other side, the Ukrainian army is advancing in the east and in the south, so the situation is changing constantly, every day. Yeah.
Okay, so basically Russia is fighting Ukraine over territory. Is that okay?
Yeah. And also, Ukraine, as I said, and as I've shown you at the beginning of my presentation, has been part of the Soviet Union for how many? 70 years, and the Russians still feel the need to be the ones in charge, the big brother who wants to control its satellites. We had the same experience, although we weren't part of the Soviet Union. In 4 decades following the end of World War II, we were under the Soviet sphere of influence, and we were even occupied by the Soviet army in 1968, and that lasted for 20 years, the direct military occupation. So we had some, experience with Russian friendship and with Russian rule as well. And I think, again, that the ordinary Russians have no idea what's really happening, because, they are allowed to watch the official propaganda channels only, and the information there, it's something incredible. Now it's banned to receive the signal of these stations in Europe, but before the war I was able to watch the evening news on Russia 1 channel, and once there they were asking people on the streets, so what about Czechoslovakia in 1968? For us, there was a clear invasion, aggression against independent country. But for the Russians, most of the people said, oh yeah, we liberated them because there was a counter-revolution and we just came to help. And they have the same opinion after 50 years, because they just read it in the books. The kids learn about this part of history, that the Russians were the good guys. So it's happening in Ukraine now, and as I say, it's I think it's a shattering blow for the Russians as well, that they are not so popular and so loved as they expected before the war. Yeah. Did you have a question? No?
So if the sanctions aren't really working, and there's a threat of nuclear intervention, I mean, what does Russia actually want out of this that would actually help them negotiate some kind of resolution? I mean, because to me it seems apparent that it's a proxy conflict. American dollars, European dollars are going into funding support, but what's the transparency to the American public, and how can there be a better war effort, I think, to put this thing to an end? I mean, you haven't seen boots on the ground. I mean, there's a lot of people suffering, especially starvation in Africa. Famine's on the rise, and I mean, it just somebody I think in Washington's got to come up with some answers on this and get us away ahead. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the best way forward would be.
Well, as I say, now it's becoming a global crisis, global food crisis, global political crisis, and Russia is still a stable member of the Security Council within the United Nations with the right of veto. That makes any agreement impossible, because the Russians would veto everything. So, yeah, also, as I said, the winter is coming. So I'll have more information for you if you invite me again in March. Then I will know what happened in Europe during the winter, because the people are becoming more unsatisfied. And before I left Prague 3 weeks ago, there was a large demonstration with like 70,000 people who were protesting against the high prices of oil and gas. And some of them were asking, "Why don't you talk to Putin? We want the cheap gas again." Then there is this role of populist politics and populist parties who say that they are impartial, they want to prevent the war, but they are pro-Russian. So yeah, it's very complicated, and the winter will give us some answers, because it will show up which countries really support Ukraine and which countries rather would prefer their own political and economic interests.
Question about the draft that's happening in Russia. Do you think that's going to be to Russia's benefit, or do you think that's going to, you mentioned the Russian people don't have an idea, or they have the information, or do you think that the draft is going to, in essence, turn the people against, Russia? What do you think that, what impact has the draft had on Russian sentiment toward the war?
Yeah. Well, the draft or the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of Russian men, I think it will have no real effect on the fronts, because the old guys, students with no military experience, have to join the army now and are sent to Ukraine right away. They don't receive guns, they don't receive bullets. They just come, to be a manpower in the field. But they are killed in hundreds and even thousands. So I think that this will cause another inner tension within Russia, because the mothers would realize that their sons won't never come back. On the other hand, the Russians are used to suffer. During the World War II, there were 20 million dead people in the Soviet Union, and they still built on this nationalistic sentiment, that they won the World War II. They don't call it World War II, they call it the Great Patriotic War, because they claim it started in June 1941 when Germans invaded Russia. They didn't say anything about the Soviet annexation of the Baltic countries, about the partition of Poland, about Soviet aggression against Romania when they took the territory of Moldova. That was all right, but we were the victims, And now they want to continue with this very same rhetorics, that they are the victims, that in Kiev there was a fascist government who wanted to kill and expel all Russian-speaking population. This is this propaganda they were living in, and as I say, they have no real alternative to official channels, official governmental channels. As you know, they isolated their Russian internet, so basically if you're in Russia, you are not able to read the CNN news or the news from Western TV channels. You just need to rely on domestic Russian proven government sources, so which is bad.
All right, thank you, Professor Nekola, for your participation this evening, and thank you to all of the students, faculty, and staff for joining us. A special thank you to GSW TV for filming this event, and to the Office of Experiential Learning and Dr. Grissett for collaborating with us to make this to a Windows to the World event. Just a reminder, if you're here for the American Government or the World and Its People class, you have to sign in to make sure that you get credit for being here for each of those classes, as well as getting your ID scanned by Dr. Grissett for the Windows to the World credit. So that might take a few moments before you exit the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.